if you liked NAFTA and what it's done for American jobs, all indications are you will love the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, which is being promoted to us by the United States Chamber of Commerce and the White House and a number of other people who tell us we love it so much or will love it so much that we haven't even been allowed to take a look at it. Well, our next guest represents an organization that has begun to take a look at it in some detail. Melinda St. Louis is International Campaign Director, or Campaigns Director, plural, with Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. She monitors U.S. trade negotiations at the WTO and elsewhere, and is a longtime activist on a number of global economic justice issues. Melinda, thanks so much for joining us. First of all, did I say anything you disagree with there in the beginning when I said that that from all indications, if you like what the jobs NAFTA has taken away, you'll love TPP?
Well, the thing I would disagree with is that probably not very many of your listeners like NAFTA or the TPP. I think that it is, in fact, as you said, unfortunately, a NAFTA on steroids, and that will lead to, unfortunately, more job loss, more income inequality, even lower wages, and then touch on all aspects of our daily lives, from food safety to freedom on the internet to the price of our medicines. And it's really critical that people dig into this and understand it and make sure that the U.S. Congress does not approve it.
Right. Now, first of all, I should explain that was irony.
I know.
I forgot to put my irony buzzer on when I
knew that.
Yeah, but secondly, it's been said about this Trans-Pacific Partnership deal. It keeps being described by people who are artful in their phrasing and who are trying to sell it to us. It keeps being described as a trade deal. But the fact is, we trade with these countries anyway. Other people have characterized it as much more of an intellectual property deal, as much more of a bypassing of the courts through extrajudicial, secret arbitration processes that would be inclined to favor corporations over governments and individuals. Is it fair to say that it's a mischaracterization to call this a trade agreement?
It's absolutely a mischaracterization. The free trade brand has now been used to try to sell these types of, really, their wish list for big corporations. Big corporations had advisors, 500 to 600 of them at any given time, who were involved in helping to craft the language that are in these agreements, the rules that's in the agreements. And it really is a wish list of these big corporations of things they weren't able to achieve through our democratic process. They were able to are able to achieve in these backdoor secretive negotiations, and then the American people and the U.S. Congress have to just vote yes or no.
Right, because Congress agreed to something called fast track, a procedural limitation on how this, in both time and procedure, on how this bill would be looked at. Now, you guys have been analyzing this draft treaty since it has finally been released, and you've looked at a couple of provisions in it, and what you found has been worrisome. One of the things you looked at were the financial stability threats in it. There is a financial services chapter of this agreement. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that chapter says and why we should be concerned about it?
Sure. Unfortunately, what we've seen from the text, now that it's been finally made public after 7 years, and it was made public early November, we were able to see that really it was worse than we thought, and we were very worried because we had seen some leaks from WikiLeaks. We had been talking with negotiators, so we were very concerned. But in many areas, it was worse than we thought. And in financial services, for anyone who's worried about the power of Wall Street and the ability of banksters to be able to basically gamble with our money and create another financial crisis should be very worried about the TPP. Instead of learning the lessons of the 2008 financial crisis, what we see the TPP digging back in and digging down on deep rules that really promote deregulation and tie government's hands to enact certain common sense financial regulations. And for the first time, it actually increases the rights of banks, foreign banks, to be able to use these tribunals that you talked about to bypass our courts and to be able to use this very broad provision that has been included in past trade agreements called minimum standard of treatment. And it's very technical, but it provides a wide avenue for foreign corporations to be able to attack our laws and safeguards and get cash compensation, millions or billions of dollars. And now for the first time, foreign banks can use this broad provision to be able to attack financial regulation. So in that way, it actually is worse than we thought, and we thought it would be quite bad. We also, go ahead.
Just to jump in for a second, we're talking with Melinda St. Louis of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. So for example, there's a lot of talk of the need to reinstate something like the Glass-Steagall provision, which prevented banks in this country from gambling with their customers' money, which is federally insured. Could a foreign bank use these secret tribunals to challenge and potentially overthrow something like Glass-Steagall, or for that matter, another financial regulation?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Glass-Steagall, because in the deregulatory heyday of the early 1990s, when many of the global trade rules under the World Trade Organization that forms a basis for the rules of the TPP were negotiated, one of the things that the United States actually included in its list of commitments at the time was that they would intend to try to repeal Glass-Steagall. And as to be part of this, the General Agreement on Trade and Services at the WTO. So, and then just 1 year later, Glass-Steagall was repealed, and then, as you mentioned, that was really one of the antecedents that led to much of the financial crisis. And what we see in the TPP is that they failed to address these deregulatory rules that again, they're technical, but what it boils down to is that governments, if they're going to open up their markets to financial services from other countries, they limit them. They prescribe what kinds of regulations they can put into place across the board, not just discriminatory policies, but ones that affect domestic or foreign banks equally. And one of those rules has to do with legal entity. And just like Glass-Steagall actually put parameters on what the types of legal formations that banks could have that separated depositors from
Right.
From investors. And so it is very concerning that foreign banks, I mean, there are what are supposed safeguards around prudential measures, but of course it's these tribunals that it's up to them to decide in the end, whether in some of these areas whether these are prudential or not. So
let me just jump in for a second, Melissa. I'm sorry. So let me just jump in for a second, Melinda. So what we're really talking about is a loss of sovereignty in a way. We're talking about the fact that the elected representatives of the American people, or for that matter, any other signatory country to this deal, are giving up the right to decide for themselves certain ways in which they want to regulate even a critical sector like banking.
Yes, well, and if we choose not to roll back these regulations, then basically U.S. taxpayers are on the hook for unlimited damages. And that's what the TPP says, that these unaccountable tribunals, these foreign banks can bypass our courts. And by the way, under TPP, this expands our liability enormously, because it's going to double the number of foreign corporations that would be newly empowered to use these types of mechanisms against the U.S., and not to mention U.S. banks using these types of mechanisms in other countries to challenge important regulations. And as we know, the global financial system is very intertwined. It's in all of our interests for there to be global financial stability. And we see other rules in the TPP, such as bans on important tools like capital controls that are really important for particularly developing countries to maintain their financial stability.
So let's talk for a second about that. We're talking with Melinda St. Louis of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Your organization also did an analysis of the investment chapter, and it said that the TPP would vastly expand both the number of foreign investors that could use this private court system to attack U.S. policies. More than 9,200 new firms, that's doubling the current exposure, would come in, and it would expand the kinds of cases that would be brought. So in other words, the phrase reasonable expectations is used, meaning that any foreign investor could say, I reasonably expected, and not just in banking, but in a number of sectors, could say, I reasonably expected when I invested in the United States that my mercury-laced fish products would do well, but their ban on mercury has impacted that. I'm going to sue.
It's true of any new law or government action, and this is not just national level, but state and local level government actions or laws are also fair game under the investment chapter of the TPP. So a foreign company can challenge any government action. It can be a court order. It could be a new law that's passed that, say, bans a toxic substance, as you mentioned, or puts into place a moratorium on fracking, for example, because of concerns around the environment or public health. And I'm not just these aren't hypothetical. These are actual cases that have been taken under other treaties like the TPP. And in fact, investors have won cash compensation from taxpayers. So
well, let's talk about that for a second, Melinda St. Louis. The White House keeps insisting that, this won't do the bad things people have been saying. I mean, one of the concerns that has been raised by opponents of the deal is, well, for example, we'd like to know the country of origin in our food products, because it might come from a place that has a reputation for lack of safety and so on. I believe, if I recall correctly, that the White House has been saying, well, that will never happen. But we learned just recently that the World Trade Organization did rule you can't do that, isn't that a bad harbinger for the TPP?
Well, everyone in the United States who wants to know where their meat is coming from should be very concerned specifically about that case. But as you mentioned, it does lay bare that the White House, while they're saying, there's no way this could possibly roll back our food safety laws, etc., we have real life examples of trade agreements and trade tribunals doing just that. The very popular policy of country of origin labeling of beef and pork, 92% of Americans support it. Hard fought, important consumer label has been ruled multiple times at the WTO. The U.S. lost our last appeal, saying that was a barrier to trade, and therefore, if we did not repeal the law, then now Canada and Mexico, which are the countries that brought the case at the WTO, can impose $1 billion in sanctions on U.S. exports every year until we change that law. And the investment chapter of the TPP is a little different in that they don't impose sanctions. What they do is it requires the taxpayers to pay millions or billions of dollars as is determined by these unaccountable tribunals. And let me just say who these tribunals are for a second. It's 3 private lawyers. These are not judges. This is not the way you think of as a court. They are private lawyers who can one day represent a corporation and argue to get cash compensation from taxpayers, and the next day sit on a tribunal as an arbitrator and decide whether these broad investment rights have been violated by a government to a foreign corporation. So there's this, and they get paid by the hour, corporate rates. There's a huge incentive for these cases to go on for years. Even when governments win, they often have to pay millions of dollars in legal fees. It's an average of $8 million.
So it's the ultimate revolving door, and at the same time, corporations can bring lawsuits, but working people can't bring lawsuits, consumers can't bring lawsuits, ordinary citizens can't bring lawsuits, right? It's the corporations and the lawyers that work for the corporations deciding how the corporations should fare against governments like our own, right?
That's exactly right. And governments don't even have the right to sue corporations. It's only a one-way street. Foreign corporations can sue the government.
Well,
Citizens, governments, nobody else has that right.
And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. There's a lot more we could talk about, but Melinda, where can people go to find out more about the work you guys are doing?
Well, you can go to tradewatch.org, www.tradewatch.org. You can find us on Facebook at Global Trade Watch, and also website exposethetpp.org.
Great. Melinda St. Louis, International Campaigns Director for Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.